the only time frogs are ever mentioned. However, I think what Aristophanes is doing is he's making fun of the tragic poets who love to use language, and they love the idea of hearing their own poetic voice. We're in fact going to hear this later when Euripides and Aeschylus are fighting between each other, and it literally looks like a couple of academics going at it over the silliest of debates or whatever. It will remind us of this chant of the frogs, this song of the frogs, right? And, of course, Aristophanes, he loves to be able to play his games. Well, once across, and of course, Xanthias has to walk, right? Once across, the next part of our story is they're gonna meet up with Iolcus. Iolcus is going to immediately mistake Dionysius for Hercules, and he gets mad at him. You stole Servius, the three-headed dog. I'm mad at you. And you have this really interesting kind of exchange then. And through the process, Dionysius and his slave, Xanthias, will change garments. And in other words, they take on different personas because Dionysius wants no longer to be considered Hercules. He wants to be considered the slave. And it's funny because Xanthias immediately will say, well, yes, I am Hercules, and yes, I did steal your dog Service. How about this? Why don't you punish not me? Why don't you punish, because I'm the great Hercules, why don't you punish my slave? In other words, why don't you punish, who is actually Dionysius? Dionysius immediately pipes up and he says, no, you can't punish me. I don't want to be tortured. I'm a god. I don't feel any pain anyway. So you get this kind of back and forth going on. And we believe that Greek audiences love this kind of thing. But wait a minute. Think about this. We are during the Dionysian festival, or they're close by, and we are making fun of Dionysius, okay? So I think Aristophanes is on to something here, or he's on to maybe this notion of how Euripides made Dionysius out to be a certain kind of very extreme kind of god, especially in the Bacchae, right? When we are, finally we get down into the underworld itself, and we're ready then for the next part of the play. The next part of the play, and what really is the heart of the play, is the contest then that's going on. During a conversation about what's going on up on Earth, we'll get a conversation about also what's happening here down in the underworld. And what's happening here down in the underworld, we're told, is that the dead are rioting. They're taking different sides about a contest that's going on. Xanthias asks, why? What's the matter? And Iolcus says, there's a custom here where all the crafts and the good and the noble crafts, that the chief master of his art in each shall have his dinner in the assembly hall and sit by Pluto's side. So the question is, who will be the artist that's considered the greatest artist who gets to sit by Pluto or Hades' side? And they begin to talk about the tragic chair. 'Twas he that occupied the tragic chairs in his craft the noblest. And Xanthias says, who does now? Who sits in that chair? When Euripides came down, we're told, he just recently has died. When Euripides came down, he kept flourishing off before the highwaymen, the thieves, the burglars, the parricides. These form our mob in Hades, till with listening to his twists and turns and pleas and counterpleas, they went mad on the man and hailed him first and wisest. Elate with this, he claimed the tragic chair. In other words, well, when Euripides showed up, we're in Hades. All the bad guys in Hades, all the bad guys in hell, they said, there's our man. You can already begin to see that Aristophanes is beginning to get his jabs in on Euripides. And it won't surprise us at the end of this play that Dionysius is going to select not Euripides as the writer, as the poet, to bring back to Athens, to save Athens, but rather the old traditional Aeschylus, right? To continue, he took the tragic chair where Aeschylus was actually seated. Wasn't he pelted? Asks Xanthias the slave. Oh, not he. The populace clamored out to try which of the twain was wiser in his art. You mean the rascals? Aye, as high as heaven, in other words. And were there none to side with Aeschylus? Xanthias asks. And Achios says, scanty and sparse, the good, the same as here. And where does Pluto now propose to do? He means to hold a tournament. So we're going to get a tournament, a jousting tournament. For those of you who have seen Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead and the Game of Questions, Tom Stoppart's great play, The Game of Questions, a lot of that is going to come from this very play, where now we're going to have a tournament of a kind to decide who is the very best poet, and bring their tragedies to the proof. And Xanthias asks, Sophocles? How came he not to claim the tragic chair? I mean, everyone thinks Sophocles is maybe the very greatest playwright. Claim it? Not he. When he came down, he kissed with reverence Aeschylus and clasped his hand and yielded willingly the chair to him. In other words, Sophocles recognizes Aeschylus as the greatest writer. Now, this is insignificant because here in a little bit, at the end of the play, Sophocles is going to end up taking Aeschylus's chair as Aeschylus leaves to go up, and Euripides is going to be left pouting in a corner. You can almost think about Plato at the beginning of the Republic, when Thrasymachus at the end of Republic 1 is left kind of pouting in a corner. We're going to see Euripides in the same light, right? Just to continue this, again, Actius will say, and then I hear, will wonderful things be done, the art poetic will be weighed in scales. In other words, we're going to make our determination about who's the greatest writer, and we're even going to have scales that kind of play the... And Xanthias is like, what? Weigh out tragedy? Like butcher's meat? Later it's going to be a block of cheese. Now, I think there's a lot going on here, and a few years later, about 40 years later, Aristotle will write his classic Poetics. But, you know, it's a funny thing to ask, and I do this in other lectures, and I'll resurrect it again. How is it possible that on one night, these incredibly wealthy, unbelievably bright people all get dressed up to the nines, and they all show up in a building for the Academy Awards, and someone gets named Best Actor, or a movie gets named Best Movie, and people stand up and they applaud and they clap? It's a very serious business, this thing of winning an Academy Award. At no point does any one of those really, really bright people stand up and say, wait a minute, this is a stupid project. How can you give an award for the best acting job, or the best script, or the best music? Isn't art in the eye of the beholder? I mean, on what grounds do you make the decision that's the best movie? I mean, it's amazing how many times the best movie is not the movie that makes the most money in the previous year. No, not at all. Well, then on what grounds do you get to decide this? Well, some people see the whole project as silly. Aristophanes, it seems, maybe saw the whole project as silly. Why? Because in the end, the mob often gets to decide, and because the mob or public opinion gets to decide, and here's Aristophanes at his conservative best, he's going to argue oftentimes the mob gets to decide, and that's not the right way to decide what's right and what's wrong in Athens, for example. So we're playing the same game. Skilled men, however, are hard to find, Actius says, in terms of deciding who's the best one. For with the Athenians, Aeschylus somehow did not hit it off. So here we go. This is Aeschylus, or Aristophanes, making the observation. Aeschylus is no longer respected, quote unquote, the way he should be. And that's, I think, what stands behind much of what's about to happen in this play, okay? So Dionysius says, that's fine. I'm going to be the judge. I'm going to decide what is the best kind of writer, and by extension, what makes writing even important in the first place. So this starts to become now less of a comedy, although certainly the satire is going to remain here, and more of a serious play about plays, about poets, about writers, about artists, we would say today, and about texts in general. Think about, again, Aristotle's Poetics coming in 335 BCE, which is roughly 40 years after this play has been written, right, in 405 when it is presented. So now we've got the contest, all right? So here we go. This is the end of the play. We're going to have the contest now in The Frogs between Euripides, the poet who has just died, the writer of the Bacchae, for example, or the Hippolytus, which are the two that we've studied here in this volume 8 of the Harvard Classics, and we'll have against him Aeschylus. Now it's significant that even in the 8 tragedies that were selected for this volume, 4 of the 8 were selected to be from Aeschylus. Why? Well, his Oresteia is there, and then Prometheus Bound is there. And everybody understood that this is the real debate. Aeschylus represents, for your notes, Aeschylus represents the old, the conservative, the moral, the best of the old ways, and then Euripides represents the new. And for Aristophanes, the degenerate, okay? And he's going to make that point ringing loud and clear. Well, how are they going to have a contest? Well, it's pretty interesting. They're both going to quote from their own plays, and at the same time, they're both going to ridicule the other. Now, this play turns really subtle, and again, I wish that we could go through this line by line. We just don't have time. I hope that you read it on your own, and I hope that you read scholars who will comment to help you understand on your own all of the subtlety that's going on here. Dionysius steps from being kind of a silly buffoon, dressing up like Hercules, dressing down like Xanthias the slave, not wanting to get beaten and that kind of thing, not liking to row. All of a sudden he turns into the judge, which makes sense because of course he's the god of theater, right? Now all of a sudden he's turning into a judge, a critiquer of what we might say, a critiquer of texts, all right? And so how's it going to work? Well, Euripides and Aeschylus are going to have a go at each other. And the way that this unfolds is significant. Euripides will, in fact, speak first. And he will say, "Don't talk to me. I won't give up the chair. I say I'm better in the art than Aeschylus." And Dionysius says, "Hey, Aeschylus, did you hear what he said? Why don't you speak?" And Aeschylus then will come back, "Ha! Sayest thou so, child of the garden queen, and this to me, thou chattery babble collector?" And then he starts to insult him. And Dionysius will then say, "Hey, listen, let's have a real conversation here." We're back to the Song of the Frogs again, right? Let's have a real conversation here. And Euripides' arguments are interesting. He says, "Hey, first of all, my characters are real. I don't play this silly idealized game, Aeschylus, that you played in yours. My characters are real." Aeschylus comes back and he says, "Well, okay, yeah, they're degenerates is what they are. For example, this whole thing about Phaedra wanting Hippolytus on stage and sex and all of that, that's gross. My characters," Aeschylus says, "are more idealized, but they're heroic. They show audiences models of virtue and how one should aspire to virtue." Euripides comes back and he says, "Man, your stuff is old, it's boring, it's formulaic, it's predictable, we know exactly how it's going to end." You kind of get this subtle suggestion that what Aristophanes is saying with Euripides is, "Bet you didn't see the end of the Bacchae coming, did you?" And in fact, you can imagine that in 405, the same year this play was presented, that audience members were stunned when Mama comes walking on stage with the head of her son, the severed head of her son, because she just tore off his head from the rest of his body. Dude, if you put that in a movie today, that would seem extreme. It was certainly extreme 400 years before Christ was born. And Euripides says, "Man, my stuff is not formulaic. It's not predictable. It's a little bit edgy. It's far more edgier than anything Aeschylus." You kind of get a sense as well that Aeschylus is going to make the argument that his stuff is maybe more valuable because it's edgy. The response by Aeschylus is what we kind of assume is really Aristophanes' whole point, which is why in the end he's going to choose Aeschylus. He ain't going to choose Euripides, right? And Aeschylus' response is fascinating. Again, I can't go through all of this, but I'll give you some of the high points. Aeschylus will say this. He says, "If then you have done the very reverse, found noble-hearted and virtuous men, and altered them each and all for the worse, pray, what is the meed you deserve to get?" Right? Dionysius says he deserves to die. In other words, Aeschylus will make the argument to Euripides, you've been a negative element on the Athenian culture. He says, Aeschylus continues, he says, "No harlotry business deformed my plays, and none can say that I ever drew a love-sick woman in all my days." We think here of Phaedrus, right? "You showed how cockles are made." In other words, men who lose their women because of sex and all of that. "And lo, you were struck yourself by the very same fate." We got a sexual kind of jab being played out here. Then he continues and he says, "Moreover, to prate, to harangue, to debate is now the ambition of all in the state. Each exercise ground is in consequence found deserted and empty. Nobody wants to work out anymore. To evil repute your lessons have brought our youngsters and taught our sailors to challenge, discuss, and refute the orders they get from their captains. And yet, when I was alive, I protest that the knaves knew nothing at all save for rations to call and to sing, "Let's pull at the oars through the waves." The idea of rowing comes back again. You'll remember earlier, Dionysius didn't want to row. Aeschylus's argument is a fascinating one. He says, you have ruined the Athenian state by teaching the value of critical thinking. It is a dangerous thing to teach critical thinking, because the last thing we want are soldiers standing in the middle of the battle doing critical thinking when their general tells them to attack. Attack now. And soldiers go, gee, I don't know. Let's talk about this one. Why do you think it's better that we attack instead of wait? No. This is not what can happen. Aristophanes, the conservative, through the voice of Aeschylus, is accusing Euripides of being responsible for, are you ready for it, corrupting the youth. Sophistry, sounding very much like the critique that Miletus will give against Socrates. Again, go back to that lecture of Plato's Apology, right? Dionysius will then say, again, he will second this, and he will say, now, he says it's true, the young people, they harangue, they debate, we think of the frog song again, they dispute, and won't row. We're back again. Remember, Dionysius earlier didn't want to row. And idly and aimlessly float to and fro. And then Aeschylus will continue, and he says it, of what ills is he not the creator and cause? So now we're just going to get nasty. Okay? This is Aristophanes using Aeschylus in the underworld to have a debate. Now, for those of you that follow my lectures on Dante's Inferno, of course Dante knows this text, and of course he's playing a similar game with some of the exchanges in the underworld, right? Okay? But notice here, Aeschylus, he can get very nasty. It's actually Aristophanes talking about what Euripides did to damage Athenian society. Take a look. Consider the scandalous scenes that he draws, his bawds and his panders, his women who give birth in the sanctuary shrine, the sanctuary and the shrine. Thinking of simile here, right? Whilst others with brothers are wedded and bedded, and others opine that not to be living is truly to live, and therefore our city is swarming today with clerks and with demagogue monkeys. We're talking about the sophists. Here, of course, Socrates comes to mind, who play their jackanite tricks, their rhetorical tricks, at all times, in all places, deluding the people of Athens. But none has training enough in athletics to run with the torch in his hand at the races. And Dionysius says, by the powers, you are right. This is the idea that what is wrong with Athens is directly related to the arts, and more particularly to the artists, especially an edgy artist like Euripides. I mean, I'm trying to help you get a sense of how this is a pretty conservative argument. What Aristophanes is saying is actually fundamentally wrong with the Athenian society. Well, it's here then that Dionysius has had enough, and finally he is less the fool now, and he's a good judge. He's in his proper, of course, habitat, and there's some amazing poetic discussions that happen here. This is, in my estimation, the true genius of this play, and it's the serious question of this play as well. How do you decide which is good art and which is bad art? It seems that Aristophanes is answering that good art is what makes the state better, and that bad art is what makes the state worse. Ironically, that's exactly the argument that Plato makes, as we have pointed out in other lectures in Republic. Well, the question, of course, is how to end this. Who wins? And in the end, what we've got to do is we've got to bring out the scales. Enough, Dionysius says. Enough of both your odes, right? Because they're quoting from their own plays and that kind of thing. Enough, Aeschylus says, enough for me. Now would I bring the fellow to the scales. It's time to weigh. That alone shall test our poetry now. This is Aeschylus' suggestion. And prove whose words are weightiest, his or mine. Bring out the scales. And by the way, this is the joke in Monty Python's Holy Grail. We shall use the larger scales. This is the game that's being played. Of course, we immediately as well think about Milton and his justice, scales of justice in Paradise Lost. The same game is being played here, only now it's a joke, right? Dionysius says, then both come hither, since I needs must weigh the art poetic like a pound of cheese. So now it's not meat, but it's cheese. And we're going to have this game that gets played where they're both going to quote their lines, and we're going to see which one is the heavier, more weightier lines. Now, of course, we're playing games in the Greek just like we're playing them in English. To say that some argument is weighty or some words are weighty doesn't mean that they're longer words. It just simply means they're heavier. And yet we're going to have this same debate. Aeschylus will win because he quotes two chariots and two dead charioteers, and they by definition are heavier. It's all kind of linguistic joking here. Dionysius still can't decide who to take back to earth. Both are my friends, he says. I can't decide between them. I don't desire to be at odds with either. One is so clever, one delights me so. And Dionysius, in this conversation he's having with Pluto, Hades, right? And Pluto says, okay, look, you got to end this thing. Figure this out. Which one are you going to take back to earth with you, right? Then take the winner, Pluto says, so will your journey not be made in vain. Dionysius will return, heaven bless your highness. Listen, I came down after a poet. Euripides asks, to what end? Dionysius says, so that the city saved may keep her choral games. Now then, whichever of you two shall best advise the city, he shall come with me. And then Alcibiades is mentioned as well as an important current figure. Alcibiades, the Alcibiades from Plato's Symposium. We talked about that in another lecture. So the question now is simple. Who do you choose by virtue of who will give the best advice to save the city of Athens? Euripides will use clever words, but he doesn't seem to say anything that means anything. And in fact,